one of the first priorities is the need to develop diversified, liquid, free markets, essentially, for critical minerals.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alberto Rosende, your host and CEO of M2I Global, a critical minerals supply chain company. And welcome back to the Minerals, Metals Initiative, a podcast exploring the transformation of the critical minerals supply chain as we race for global resilience, from mineral extraction and refinement to policy and innovation. Each episode, we will examine a different aspect of the urgent push to modernize, diversify, and de-risk the world's critical minerals supply chain. This is our first episode of Season 2, where we will focus on the theme of execution. And what better way to begin a season about execution than with today's guest, Arnab Datta. Arnab is the Managing Director of Policy Implementation at Employ America, where he leads the integration of policy and legal strategy across the organization's advocacy efforts. He is also the Director of Policy Implementation at the Institute for Progress, a nonpartisan think tank focused on innovation policy. His work focuses on translating complex ideas into actionable policy, including drafting legislative frameworks for initiatives like a strategic resilience reserve. Arnab previously served in the office of Senator Michael Bennet, clerked for the Senate Judiciary Committee, and worked at Crowell and Mooring LLP. And his writing has appeared in major outlets, including the New York Times, Financial Times, Washington Post, and Business Insider. Arnab, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks again. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And I know that you come to us from by way of two organizations that you're involved with. So why don't you go ahead and give me a little background on yourself and then the two organizations that you're affiliated with, and then we'll get started.
So I work at two organizations. The first, Employ America, is a macroeconomic policy-focused organization. We do a lot of research and advocacy. Our North Star is full employment, but we really take a macro lens. So we do a lot of work in the advocacy space on the market side. We do a lot of work on the Federal Reserve as well. But particularly as it relates to our conversation today, we spend a lot of time thinking about commodity market stabilization. So everything from crude oil, which is very timely in this moment, but then also growing effort of work in critical minerals just because they're becoming more and more important throughout the economy. And then I also work in an organization called IFP, where we're really focused on advancing scientific, technological, and industrial progress. And I lead the policy implementation at IFP, which is, I cut across a number of different teams, but I previously led the infrastructure policy team, where we did a lot of work on next generation technology, but also in the permitting context, which I think will be relevant to our conversation as well today. So I touch a lot of different areas close to the energy and commodities sector, and excited to talk to you today.
No, absolutely. And I mean, the areas that you cover fall really square into what I believe is probably the most important topic of the day. And it will be for quite some time. So I really appreciate, again, your time. And to kind of get started, I figured that, we can talk about a lot of what's going on today within the current administration and just prior to the administration coming into power, looking at critical minerals and looking at the policies that were involved in trying to move the sector forward and secure those supply chains. So where do you believe would be a good point of departure for our dialogue when you look at the last couple of years, if you will, in terms of the critical mineral supply chain?
Yeah, look, I think I think to me the thing that is striking is that there's actually quite a bit of consensus that we need to have a lot more intervention in this sector. If you go back to the Biden administration, in the one of the signature achievements of the administration was the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a tremendous amount of resources that were committed to the critical minerals sector, both in the context of the production tax credits, 45X, dedicated programs at the Loan Programs Office for mining processing projects for next generation clean tech. I think, and then the 30D electric vehicle tax credit, which has now been taken away, but across these areas, you saw a great deal of resources dedicated to that, and that even though some of those things have been pulled back, some of them have been changed. This administration, the Trump administration, is also dedicating, quite a great deal of effort. You see this in an individual deal context where they're cutting these deals with specific companies, MP Materials, Vulcan, and then there's also, some more sectoral initiatives. So there's Project Vault, which is the commercial stockpile that Exim is setting up. And then also there's the initiatives out of the State Department and the U.S. Trade Representative in the form of the Plurilateral and Project Forge, I believe it's called. And then also, branching into the AI emerging tech space with Pax Silica. So there is certainly a lot of, continuity. I think we can go back to, really decades when this has been a notable issue. Even in the Obama administration, there were reports and discussions of our vulnerabilities here when China first clamped down on Japan in wake of the Senkaku Islands dispute. And so, now I think you're starting to see this continuity take form of intervention in the private sector in a more direct way by the government.
Thanks for that overview. And I think it is important to kind of understand that this has been ongoing for quite some time. Not just in the last year or two or three, but it goes back to Obama and maybe even earlier with a focus on supply chains. I wanted to get your take on looking at the current policy efforts, but I really wanted to take a look at everything that the current administration has done and what are the key pillars that we can currently look at as foundational to the efforts going forward that will help us kind of describe the effects that those policies and executive orders have done to take shape, if you will, in the market.
I'm not sure when this will air, but if it's any time kind of in the next couple of weeks, I think this should stay current. So the Trump administration has signed a number of largely a lot of the deals that have been signed are letters of intent. And so it's important to understand that these are, they are announcements. There's an executive order. There's actually, I think, been multiple executive orders on critical minerals that direct different agencies to take a number of different actions. Executive orders are useful as directing actions for agencies, but, on their own, they rarely have kind of any direct impact, right? They need to be implemented by various agencies. And so I think you can, I would say probably aside from the executive orders, the first real big action that drew a lot of attention was the deal in August that was signed that was agreed to between the Trump administration and MP Materials. So this is a pretty comprehensive deal across the value chain that essentially takes MP Materials, which owns the Mountain Pass mine, and had been, starting to invest in the processing sector as part of the chain as well, and basically takes them and supercharges them into the nation's premier vertically integrated rare earth magnet manufacturer. So they have in that deal alone, it's a multi-billion-dollar deal. There's a $400 million equity investment. There's a price floor for mined NdPr that's kind of pulled out of the mine there. There's a guaranteed EBITDA. There's a loan. There's a guaranteed offtake agreement for finished magnets. And so, that's quite a comprehensive deal for this single company. That is probably the most, the deal that has the most kind of clarity to it. That deal is contingent on future appropriations coming into the Defense Production Act office. So another good example of this is Project Vault, which is this commercial stockpile that has been set up at Exim. They've identified a number of partners, original equipment manufacturers who will be kind of the ones participating in this kind of in procurement from this commercial stockpile that is being set up with Exim Capital, Lend Capital. And then they've identified 3 intermediaries, Hartree, Traxys, and Mercuria, who will be kind of doing the actual operation of the reserve essentially. And so, I think that's like where again it takes time to stand these things up, but there's a lot of momentum. And I would say one thing that I think you can characterize accurately with the Trump administration's activities so far is even where I kind of disagree with the structure of what it's done, they are deploying a pretty robust toolkit. You're seeing the use of equity investments. You've seen a price floor. These are not things that are typically done by the federal government, and so I would say that's like something that's can characterize a lot of their activities. Even in the Project Vault deal, that's a loan or a loan guarantee that is being provided by Exim, and they're using that capital for a commercial stockpile. Essentially, it's a pretty creative use of the authority.
Arnab, I think that, when it comes to Project Vault, it's the $12 billion they talk about, where 10 billion is a loan that will
Yeah,
come from Exim, and then almost 2 billion, it's like 1.7 billion, will be private funding, which I think is an
yeah,
interesting aspect to
yeah,
talk about, because you talk about some of the Treasury Secretary's call for a project, kind of a warp speed project for the critical mineral
yes,
supply chain. You also kind of delve into a little bit of how the Chinese became so dominant. And in those, you
yeah,
talk about some of the financial structures that are missing on our side. And I think that
yeah,
it's important to see how maybe the current actions by the administration, whether it's the executive orders, the deal with MP Materials, or some of the other deals, and some of the levers that they're using, and how they're attributed directly to those EOs or policies that they're implementing that maybe still needs to be funded through appropriation. We understand that. But if you
yeah,
can kind of walk us through how that turns into real execution to
yeah,
resolve some of those plumbing issues that you kind of referred to that were missing
yeah.
from the financial structure within the US as compared to China. Because I think those are some of the actionable levers that we really need to see on an ongoing
Yes.
basis. If you could
Yeah.
walk us through those, I think that would be important.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think it's important to step back and really understand. Um, Everyone kind of knows how China dominates the critical mineral space. You hear all these different statistics, they control 70% of processing of this and 90% of processing of that. And everyone kind of understand, and, they control this many assets. But it's really important to understand how comprehensive China's strategy here was. It was really built on three prongs. The first is robust industrial policy in the critical minerals sector. And so you saw this targeted at the processing sector specifically. In the context of rare earths, they started the rare earths office in the mid 70s, started to kind of ramp up processing capacity. And then really in the 90s, you saw that take off, with kind of like it's almost like an exponential curve. And that's really when they started to control a lot of the processing capacity in rare earths. And then there was a second piece of it, which you hear a lot about too, which is an international asset acquisition strategy. So they essentially went out, they purchased mines. They purchased all over South America, Latin America, Africa, so that they could have secure access for the processing that they had built. But there's a third piece of this that really goes underemphasized, and this is what we've kind of described as the market infrastructure problem. And if you look at modern commodity markets, they're underpinned in the metals and minerals context, particularly for ones that are more kind of deep, liquid, mature markets. They're underpinned by market infrastructure. This is essentially the benchmark contracts, the exchanges, the intermediaries, the logistics networks that underpins and intermediates risk in a modern commodity market. Now, the most, liquid example of this is the crude oil market, where, even though we've had a massive disruption right now in the Strait of Hormuz, and lost, 10 to 15 million barrels a day, we still see that like there's some resilience built into the market because, there's storage in different places and reserves. And this is true in metals markets too. But it is not as mature in the critical minerals sector. And so China really explicitly set up some of these newer market infrastructure pieces. So, as an example, they set up the Baotou Rare Earths Exchange, which was done with the explicit purpose of controlling more of the pricing of the rare earth sector. This also coming out of the global financial crisis, you saw a lot of Western commodity banks and other financial sectors close their desks. So you just saw this huge loss of liquidity in the market, which is really necessary for intermediating the risk. And that's, one major factor why we don't build a lot of this stuff here. It also drives volatility because when it's all in China, or, indexed to the Chinese market, it's their supply and demand that can really, really drive what's happening all across the world. And so just to give you kind of one example of how this can play out, when all that market infrastructure is in China, let's say you've got the Tesla gigafactory in Texas, it's purchasing spodumene, lithium precursor for its batteries, and it's purchasing it from Quebec. Well, they have to use a price index. This is like standard practice for purchasing, any of these commodities. And that price index is entirely going to be based on the Chinese market. And so if there's oversupply in the Chinese market, even though that transaction does not touch China in any way, the value of that contract is now going down for that mine in Quebec or, North Carolina, wherever it is, and they're now losing revenue. And so this is really how this kind of translates into the economy, how these prices are discovered. And so, in the context of current policy, I think this is still one gap. It's a very difficult thing to solve because you need private actors to really take this up. But I will say that, the Trump administration has signed a number of bilateral deals with, prime ministers of Australia, Japan. This was also in the language at the plurilateral meeting at the State Department a couple of weeks ago, where, one of the first priorities is the need to develop diversified, liquid, free markets, essentially, for critical minerals. And so I think they've recognized that. It's very difficult to do. They signed the MP materials deal, as I said, but that deal is still indexed to an Asian market benchmark. And so that's, vulnerability right there, that in that deal, if the Asian market goes down, it's going to cost DoD quite a bit more. You can't solve that problem immediately necessarily, but it's, I think it shows that we need to really build this long-term market infrastructure if we're going to have a more sustainable corrective path going forward.
So I guess just to go back on the last point that you made, when you look at the deal between the DPA-3 DoD within the MP materials deal, you've basically transferred the risk to the DoD and the people of the United States so that MP material can stay solvent and meet that 10-year offtake agreement.
Exactly. So essentially, if you're MP Materials, you've got this price floor on NdPr. It's $110 per kilogram, and the if the market price is $70, it means DoD is filling in that $40. If it's $90, they're filling in $20. But that what the price is, I'm using quote unquote for audio listeners, what that price is measured by an Asian metals market index. That's in the SEC filings. And so if China floods the market with NdPr, it means that price that was, now maybe $100 or $90 could go down to 70. And so for every kilogram, instead of spending $10, DoD is now spending $50.
Right.
So it's a considerable amount of exposure. That might be necessary in this context. Like, we want to keep this mine online. I think, I wrote a long piece with a colleague, Peter Harrell, in Bloomberg, where we kind of evaluated the MP Materials deal. And I think that this is an unfortunate piece of its structure. But, there are really difficult trade-offs here. And sometimes you might have to make these choices. But I think it also demonstrates why we need to, have something long-term in place in terms of a policy to support, new benchmarks that are not so indexed entirely to the Chinese market.
When we talk about, the Chinese dominance of the market and the monopolization by the Chinese, everybody sees, oh, they're just producing so much, or they control all of the processing but the thing is that we have to take those steps back to understand, well, all of the processing that used to exist elsewhere has gone by the wayside because of the manipulation and the cost. If it's less volatile to go process elsewhere and still get their
Yeah.
material, they're going to be fine with it. And I
Yeah.
do that with air quotes because nobody's
Hmm.
fine with anything just that. And as a
Yeah.
matter of fact,
We talk a lot about the price issue. You hear Western producers talking about it a lot, but the policy conversation just does not focus enough on how prices are discovered through the economy. And that's really a function of the market and the market infrastructure that I described. I will say just like one quick thing is I think there's growing recognition here. We've been working on a bill with Representative Rob Whitman on the House and Chris Pappas and Senators Jean Shaheen and Todd Young in the Senate. We've now got 10 sponsors on the Senate side, and I don't know how many on the House, but many. It's a bipartisan, bicameral bill called the Secure Minerals Act. And addressing this market infrastructure problem is an explicit purpose of that act. And it's set up intentionally to do that. And so, I think that you're starting to see more and more recognition of this issue.
I think that it's important to understand that the government needs to kind of create the rails for this to kind of
Yes.
move forward. But really, it's the private sector actors that have to step forward. So, in the act that now is gathering steam, could you take us and walk us through what the act will do and then what will be the expectation from the private sector to move forward? And what incentives are created for them to do so? Because at the end of the day, private sector works on incentives, right?
The bill establishes a government corporation called the Strategic Resilience Reserve Corporation of the U.S. So this is an idea that I had proposed with a colleague, Dilip Singh, a couple of years ago. And, it's a government corporation. It has reserve in the name. Is a reserve aspect to it where it would build physical stockpiles where necessary. But the focus of it really and where its tools are oriented are on building that private market ex-China and really encouraging private sector actors to do so, whether it's, miners, processors, benchmark, exchanges, whether it's CME or new companies like ABAX, and intermediaries to all play their part in building up that market. And so there's a couple of things that I think are important about its structure. One, it's an independent corporation. When you're thinking on the timeline and horizon of what a market needs, you need long-term durable policy. I think, over the past couple of presidential cycles, whether it's, the LNG pause in the Biden administration or, some of the stuff that's happening right now with wind and solar, or, you need more continuity than presidential cycle, election cycles can afford. And so this would be an independent government corporation that would be empowered to kind of enact long-term policy. It's got a very diverse toolkit. So a lot of the things that we've talked about today in the toolkit, it can deploy, but with the purpose of incentivizing more market activity. So like, just to give you one example, I mentioned earlier how after the global financial crisis and because of the capacity overhang, you saw a lot of Western financing institutions close their, commodities desks essentially. So what you saw is there's this huge lack of this huge like liquidity vacuum. It just left the market. And so this corporation would be empowered to lend to authorized intermediaries. So we're talking about companies like Traxys, like Mercuria, like Hartree. And what it does is, if you take a market, let's say like lithium, now lithium's in a bit of a bull run, but a couple of years ago, things were really bad. The price was $1,000 a ton for spodumene. And, one challenge you had there was, I talked to a lot of people at that time who were like, why is nobody buying the dip? Why is nobody buying the dip? Well, the reason is because if you're a Traxys or a Traf, you can't get lending for that. You can't get a loan. And so you have to purchase on a cash basis. And for you to get, an IRR comparable to iron ore or, coal or one of these more mature markets, you have to get that price down to 700 before you're willing to buy. But when you introduce leverage into that conversation, then they can go and buy at a higher price, at $1,000, $1,100, and then a mine doesn't need to go on care and maintenance. And so what happens in that, you get essentially a natural price floor. Like the market is serving it's creating a price floor of its own. So part of this, is intended to provide leverage so you can get more liquidity into the market. But you could also see, equity investments, other kinds of contracts where they could support, exchanges who are setting up some of these newer products. So CME, for example, is interested in a rare earths contract. It would be great to, see more capital potentially provided by this to be a market maker in that contract, as, help kind of reduce some of the startup costs. So that's really how that bill is structured, and what we're kind of intending to do.
I think that that's such an important dialogue to continue to move forward. And
Yeah.
there's an awful lot of dialogue in this space from all parties involved. There should be an awful lot of push to help get it across the line. What do you think is missing? And what if it were to be enacted, how long, what's the timeline, do you think, before it could get to the level of maturity where it really starts to have some effect?
I think it's set up to be quick acting. This is an urgent issue. There's bipartisan support, and so we would like to see it. I think, I would love to see kind of a year-long timeline to really start getting it done. I think one aspect of it, that I didn't mention is that it's equipped to, it looks kind of like the Federal Reserve in that it has multiple divisions where it can kind of retain private sector talent, whether it's in the deal making context and investment context that I mentioned, or also in the market analysis. So there's divisions of risk assessments essentially, so that these technocrats can essentially do the analysis necessary, understand the market vulnerabilities, where resilience is lacking, and they can provide that information to the board, who can then hopefully make decisions and prioritize, allocate resources accordingly. And so, doing that it's a constant process. I think, right now we're looking at disruptions coming out of the Hormuz crisis. And so you could imagine some level of, ex post risk alleviation in crises like these, but also some ex ante risk mitigation.
I know
Be
that
more proactive.
yeah, absolutely. You talked a little bit about, the issues on the petroleum market that are, occurring because of what's going on in Iran right now in the Strait of Hormuz, and the inability to have petroleum actually flow out, and so forth. And so when we start looking at energy is extremely significant in the space that we're talking about. And critical minerals obviously contribute to the distribution of that energy, and ultimately to power manufacturing, innovation. And so can you link the critical mineral and the secure supply chain through the different policies and actions that have been enacted? And what would happen if we don't have that secure supply chain, so that we can really leverage the activity that's ongoing now in the administration?
Yeah, there's certainly I think the administration released an AI action plan that was written partly by a friend of mine, Dean Ball, when he was in the administration. And there's a number of positive things in there, and so I think that they are trying to think creatively about how we can build this data center infrastructure for AI here. I think an important thing that Congress really needs to act on, and I think the administration also needs to reconsider some of its kind of actions in the solar and wind space, is passing permitting reform. We really, really need to fundamentally fix our permitting system in this country. It is just something that for too long, it's too easy to block projects. There's too many costs added to it. It takes too long to build transmission infrastructure. And if we're really going to get that kind of flywheel of innovation going that you're referring to, we need to pass permitting reform. It's incredibly important in the data center context because of how much energy generation, distribution, and transmission we need to build out. But then also in the critical minerals context, where it's important for both mining, but also on the processing side, to the extent that we're using federal dollars to build processing facilities.
I think
Yes.
it's this constant opportunity to litigate and stall and
Yeah.
litigate and stall, and just kind of wait out the ability of an initiative to move forward because funding dries up. And so
Yeah.
when you look at permitting reform, can you talk a little bit more granular to that aspect of it, and what are the recommendations, and has the current administration actually enacted any of those reforms that helps kind of shield a project once it's gone through the wickets, if you will, to move forward and not continually be, have another, boundary set up that needs to be breached in order to move through from a litigation perspective?
Yeah, so I think the thing we've focused on the most, which I think is probably, I think substantive environmental standards should be very high. We live in a rich country. We should be able to have very strong health, air quality, water quality standards, and companies should pay to enact those and build things safely. The problem is that so much of our permitting system is not about substantive standards; it's about procedural compliance. And where that ends up is, you have laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, which, you know, ostensibly was intended to be a review of environmental impacts that could inform agency decision makers in granting permits, has now become essentially a litigation hook for every single project that the federal government supports or has some action related to, whether it's granting a permit, in cross-jurisdictional issues, or whether it's a loan or loan guarantee. And the problem with that is that it's very, very difficult to predict the judicial system. You can't. What I think, potentially a lot of your audience will understand that in a judicial injunction can just blow out the NPV of a project, right? It's not something you can account for. It's not the same as substantive compliance, where you can, it might cost you money, but you know what those costs are. This is not the same. And so we've really tried to focus in on judicial certainty. It is a place where, look, I think with the administration's actions, it's very difficult for an executive branch to do much in this space. I think they've done some work on, issuing categorical exclusions and trying to find other ways to build on on federal land, where at least, directing agencies through executive orders and other things, where at least you can have one jurisdiction, but it still kind of runs into some of these challenges. And ultimately, we need Congress to fix this. Congress, established the National Environmental Policy Act. There's only so much you can do in the executive branch to address this issue. We really need Congress to enact better standards.
Okay, so that's a pretty tall order, the way that that things are going. But as long as the act continues to pick up steam and get additional folks to sign on to the act, I think that hopefully bodes well to getting it in place. You talked about the resilience reserve, and I'm just curious because I know that there's an awful lot of talk where people bring up the fact that a national defense stockpile already exists. But really, the focus and purpose of the national defense stockpile is so narrow when it comes to when it would come into play. It's such a small subset of the overall demand because it doesn't satisfy regular manufacturing within the defense industrial base. It really is only to provide for recovery from a particular event. And if you could compare that to the current Project Vault, just to kind of get an understanding of those three individual efforts, you have the National Defense Stockpile, very small subset. You have the SRR, and then you have Project Vault.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. I think you nailed it with the National Defense Stockpile, which is this is limited purpose. It is for building kind of a defense level of readiness in a pretty narrow context. I think when you think about when we've had real conflict. You need more than what is going to be in the National Defense Stockpile if it's an extended conflict, right? And I think what resilience means to me in this security context, but also in an economic resilience context, is that we have enough capacity in the economy that is dedicated where it can be diverted towards some of these strategic needs when necessary. And a National Defense Stockpile can just not solve that problem. It's one reason why, you look at really resilient defense bases, they have a robust private industrial base for these things. It's one reason why, the electric vehicles is of import because it helps you keep a level of capacity in the critical minerals sector that can be diverted towards defense needs if it ever comes to it. The data center piece of this could serve this function now because we're, going to have a lot more energy storage and battery storage potentially. And so I think of that as a really important piece of it. And the Strategic Resilience Reserve is really intended to serve that purpose. It's really about the commercial sector as much as it is certainly fulfilling a national security need, but it really is about our broader economy. I think if you look at Vault and you look at the Strategic Resilience Reserve, Vault is really like what I would see as a good example of what the Strategic Resilience Reserve would be able to do at scale. It's a limited amount of capital that Vault will have. It's good, but it's not enough to hit, the 60 odd elements that we need to secure on the periodic table. And so ideally, the Strategic Resilience Reserve can build on things like Vault as a model. I will also say that I think that Project Vault is serving more as a commercial stockpile, like a physical stockpile for the OEMs that are involved. Whereas I don't think that they're going to be taking part as much in that market infrastructure problem where, this Project Vault will be doing liquid trading in a way that kind of builds more liquidity in the market that can then, build a more sustainable market infrastructure. And so that's kind of where I think the Strategic Resilience Reserve fits in. And, there's also an innovation component to this. I use that kind of leverage example where you can, where if an intermediary can take leverage, they can go and procure some supply. A good example of this is Traxys recently signed, a 10-year, I think 50,000 ton offtake agreement with Lilac Solutions, which is a company doing pretty cutting edge direct lithium extraction. And so they're, able to deploy that capital to serve as an offtake agreement that can help Lilac now generate more investment. If Traxys had access to even cheaper capital, they could potentially make that even bigger, or they could do more versions of this. And that's kind of what we want to encourage more of.
Great, great. Now, I know that we talked a little bit about how we build some of the plumbing, if you will. And we also talked about looking across, or at least you've written about looking across our partner network, if you will, or our allies. And that brings me to Project Forge. We really haven't talked a lot about Project Forge. Could you give us an understanding of Project Forge and how it will contribute to this marketplace, if you will, amongst the partners?
Yeah, so I think Project Forge is really it is a forum amongst countries to build this critical minerals partnerships, this like market that we talked about ex-China. So it's building on some of the agreements that I mentioned with Japan and Australia, where they've set out a number of goals. And what Forge is trying to do is really create that that kind of forum for our allied countries to come together and kind of troubleshoot and create solutions to building that market. I think it is part and parcel with the effort out of the U.S. Trade Representative that came out of this kind of plurilateral meeting and effort they had at the State Department, where they're looking for ways to actually operationalize this in trade agreements, potentially with tariffs and other means to use to establish like a price floor in this kind of market ex-China. So I think it's really encouraging that we're getting the right kind of language out of these investments, that there is a focus on diversified liquid markets. And I think there's a lot to build on there.
Super. So, if you look at all of the things that we've talked about, the policies and the executive orders that have kind of laid a very clear understanding that we need to move in the direction of securing our critical mineral supply chain. There are some fundamental actions that are being taken as LOIs at this point, right? Letters of intent. We still have to see how those are actually executed, hopefully in the short term or the near term anyway. And then look forward. What would your recommendations be at this point so that we can continue to see actionable steps moving forward to secure that critical mineral supply chain ex-China? And then kind of where would the Secure Act come into play, and how that would push that further forward with real actionable, executable activities?
Yeah, so I think with if we're talking about given that we're still in kind of LOI stage that they're still kind of working through implementation details. I think one thing I would like to see, I think they are doing this, but see kind of a more strategic effort is bringing in some of these exchanges, companies, like CME, ABAX, and then more of these intermediaries to really talk about what it would take to bring more liquidity to these markets. What is the right sequencing of us? What kind of support do they need to build new benchmark contracts, and other types of, it's not always going to be benchmark contracts. Some of these aren't, I don't think there's going to be a very robust futures market for scandium. But there are versions of this that you can do to bring more price transparency to the market. Metals Hub is a company that has set up a monthly auction for lithium, that's serving quite well and kind of serving well as an alternative price benchmark to the Chinese, GFEX version of it. So I'd like to see more kind of engagement with that as part of these efforts. But look, I think, I think that it's really good that we're getting a creative use of the toolkit. I would like to see a bit more focus on competition. A lot of these are individual deals with companies, which isn't, sometimes that can be necessary. But I think there's a way to structure some of this to be a bit more market, company agnostic and more market sector. Actually, in that sense, Vault is probably the better version of it, where it's, it doesn't seem like they're putting their thumb on the scale of an individual company. So I'd like to see kind of more of that. And I think that fits in quite well with the Secure Minerals Act, where we would establish a strategic resilience reserve. We could take these efforts and really supercharge them at scale, but put them on a more durable, sustainable path.
Awesome. Well, I know that I've taken up an awful lot of your time, but before we go, I'd like to find out what's on your to-do list right now. What's on your desktop as far as where your effort's going to go in the short term?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is the Secure Minerals Act. I really want to see that push forward. We've got 2 potential vehicles to pass that under this year. The lead champion of it, Senator Shaheen on the Senate side, is retiring this year. I think it would be great for her legacy as a stalwart of the Senate for us to pass this. Todd Young is one of the best senators on these issues as well. So it'd be great to see that. We have either a national defense authorization that this could be very much part of, or the reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank, which would be another vehicle. So that's a big thing. And then I think really just trying to amplify some of these initiatives and how this can be useful more. So certainly with everything happening in the Strait of Hormuz and the war with Iran, there are kind of vulnerabilities that are arising and supply chain issues. And I think demonstrating how something like this can be useful in these situations is definitely going to be an important part of this.
Well, thanks again, Arnab. I really appreciate your time, your thoughts, and your insight into what's going on. I also agree with the direction that we're moving in and some of those things that are pending, and hopefully those things will get enacted on very, very soon. So appreciate your time again, and thanks again, Arnab.
Thank you so much for having me. Real pleasure.
And to everyone who listened or watched this episode, thank you for joining us. Be sure to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts to keep enjoying the Minerals and Metals Initiative.